Unlike other countries, Australia uses a variety of rail gauges. This is a quirk from before Federation in 1901, when not much communication was going on between states. Victoria built their rails to broad gauge, and they are the focus of this week's video. What is gauge? Gauge is the distance between two tracks. The wheels must align with the correct gauge, otherwise the train may derail, or not be able to fit at all. History. In 1854, the first rail line in Victoria was completed. Built to Irish broad gauge, 1600mm, Victoria would use this scale all the way up to present day. Soon, other colonies would build their own rail lines. With very little communication, they would all be built to different gauges. New South Wales built their gauge to Irish broad gauge, but changed last minute to British standard gauge for some unknown reason. South Australia built their gauge to Irish broad gauge, but changed to British standard gauge in the 1990s, when the closure of their rail network happened, and Victoria built their rail gauge to broad gauge. Victoria continued using broad gauge until 1962, when the first standard gauge line was built from Melbourne to the Break of Gauge station, Albury. This was built to allow passenger trains to go directly from Melbourne to Sydney, and vice versa, instead of getting off the train at Albury and hopping onto a second one. The second standard gauge line was constructed in 1995 from Adelaide to Melbourne. Instead of converting the whole line, the planners decided to convert a longer but more flat route instead. This was a real headache, as many of the goods lines were broad gauge, which meant they had to be converted to standard gauge, otherwise they had to be closed. These include Hopeton, Portland, and the Geelong to Ararat line. The latter caused a major detour to Melbourne. In 2014, a project known as the Murray Basin Rail Project was proposed, which would standardize the Mildura, Sea Lake, and Manangatang lines, which have been closed to passengers for a while now. The project would allow trains to access the ports of Geelong and Portland easier. Stage 1 involved replacing sleepers on the Mildura line, which allowed trains to run at 80 km per hour, 50 miles per hour. Stage 2 involved actually converting the Mildura line to standard gauge and reopening the Avoca line. Unfortunately, during the project, a man was killed. This led to the project not having enough funding for the rest of the stages. Stage 2 was completed, but nothing else was ever completed. Future stages involve converting the Sea Lake and Manangatang lines to standard gauge, the Maryborough and Geelong to Ballarat lines to dual gauge. However, all of these have been put on hold. What trains can and can't go on what lines? Here are all the operational lines on the Victoria network. In blue are standard gauge lines, and in red are broad gauge lines. Trains coming from Hopeton can't go on the Melbourne direct line, as they simply do not fit. They have to take a long indirect route via Cressy. Ararat trains from the same direction can go direct to Melbourne. Broad gauge trains from Dookie can go directly to Melbourne, while standard gauge trains from Albury have to go via the Chicana Freight Line. What issues does standardization cause for passenger services? Victoria has one of the best regional networks in Australia. Unfortunately, many locations which could have a passenger service don't, such as Portland, Horsham, and especially Mildura. These lines were all converted to standard gauge. If services were to run, they would have to go via the Geelong to Ararat line, which is a major detour, so a likely solution is converting the Ararat direct line to dual gauge, or have trains from Portland and Horsham terminate at Ararat and have a good time connection to Melbourne. While the Mildura line probably should be converted to dual gauge, or the Swan Hill line can be extended to Mildura. If you had a big budget, all of these lines could be converted to dual gauge. The gauge issue in Victoria is a delicate issue, but I will tackle it in two ways, one with a limited budget and one with an unlimited budget. The limited budget solution is to convert the Mildura and Ararat lines to dual gauge, and the other solution is to turn the entire network to standard gauge, which isn't likely to happen. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you liked this video about Victoria's rail gauges. If you have any suggestions on what video I should do next, then leave a comment below. If not, I'll see you later.